everybody. Welcome to the Peter Schiff Show. I hope you all enjoyed your 3-day holiday weekend. Of course, most people who were celebrating the 3-day weekend don't realize that Monday is supposed to be George Washington's birthday. And that's because most people still refer to the holiday as President's Day. But legally, it's not President's Day. It is George Washington's birthday. And I really wish that is how everybody referred to the holiday, as opposed to President's Day. You know, George Washington was born on February 22nd, which hasn't happened yet. It's going to be 22nd, later in the week. But the reason that we celebrated it on Monday was that back in 1968, they passed this Uniform Holiday Act or something like that. And it took a lot of holidays we had. I think it was Labor Day, Memorial Day, and Washington's birthday, and moved them all to a Monday. And that was so federal workers could have a 3-day weekend. That was the idea. And so instead of celebrating George Washington's birthday on his birthday, February 22nd, the holiday was observed on the third Monday of February. So it would fall somewhere near the 22nd of February. But around that time, I think it started in 1971. So they passed it in 1968, but it didn't go into effect until 1971. And what happened was a lot of the stores, right, they wanted to have sales, for the holiday. And they started calling them President's Day sales because Lincoln's birthday fell on February 12th, which we just had. Actually, Lincoln's birthday, we celebrated Washington's birthday, I think closer to Lincoln's birthday this year than Washington's. And there were a lot of states, well, I don't know if it was a lot, but there were a number of states, maybe a half dozen or so, that had state holidays for Lincoln's birthday. Right? Obviously, none of the southern states were honoring Lincoln, but you had northern states. My state, like Connecticut, it was a state holiday for Lincoln's birthday. So now you had Washington's birthday, which kind of fell in between Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday. So they started calling it the President's Day sale, President's Day. And so then the whole holiday became President's Day. And it lost all significance to Washington, because George Washington was a great man. He was a father of our country. I mean, without George Washington, there probably wouldn't be a country. We should have a day to honor the father of our country. In fact, today, we only really honor one person, and that's Martin Luther King, right? His birthday became a holiday in 1983, I think. But other than Martin Luther King, the only person who has a holiday is George Washington, and nobody even knows because we call it President's Day. And when we call it President's Day, most people don't even think, oh, we're celebrating Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday. They think we're just celebrating all the presidents, like, Joe Biden, right? Or all of them, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Barack Obama, right? They're all the same. Well, let's just honor all these presidents. No, I don't want to honor all those presidents. I want to honor George Washington. I think he's the only person who should have a federal holiday. I don't even think Martin Luther King, even if, you could argue he's a great civil rights leader, well, so what? He's not the father of our country. I think you diminish George Washington by having any other holiday after any other person, because nobody can replace George Washington when it comes to America, because there would be no United States of America, I don't think, without George Washington. Now, if you don't know a little bit about General George Washington, because a lot of people don't even know too much about the father of our country. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on Washington, because he was a towering figure. I mean, actually, literally, too, he was 6'3", which, today is not all that tall. It's still pretty tall. I mean, 6'3" is a nice height. But back in, 1770s, 1750s, that was really tall. I mean, I was probably like maybe 6'8" now. I mean, you're 6'3". You're pretty much a giant. But he was a war hero before he became a president. He was an officer in the French and Indian Wars. And that was, so the United States and the British fought the Indians, right, Native Americans, and the French. And he was an officer in that war when he was a young man, early 20s. He was an officer. He wasn't the general. And so he actually became like a folk hero of that war, because early in the war, right, he was there as a young officer, and the troops, right, were marching down, and they were ambushed by the French and the Indians. And it was a large, troop of infantry and officers, right? They outnumbered the French and the Indians, but they were ambushed, right? They weren't expecting it. And, they're, the English, they wear these red coats. They're pretty big targets, right? And they were getting slaughtered, right? The Indians were just picking them off. And, they had rifles back then. They weren't using bows and arrows, because they also, they were fighting with the French, right? So they were pretty well armed. And anyway, their goal was to kill all the officers first, right? You shoot the officers, and then the infantry is just going to scatter, right? You cut off the head, and then the rest of the troops don't know what to do. So they're targeting the officers, and they're easy to spot, the officers, because they're the ones on the horses, right? They're tall, sitting in a saddle. And so the Indians are shooting at all the officers, which includes George Washington. Every single officer on a horse gets shot. They're all killed, except Washington. He's the only one. Now, it's not like they weren't shooting at him. They shot two of his horses out from under him. So he had to get off the horse that got shot and get on another horse that got shot and get on another horse. But they still didn't get him. And when he's the last officer still on a horse, he led the troops to safety. So, so they all didn't get killed. And when he gets back and he looks at his coat that he's wearing, he's got 4 bullet holes in his coat. So he got shot by 4 bullets inside his coat, but not a single bullet actually hit him. And then he was like, he had bullet fragments in his hair. Just a complete miracle that he didn't get killed. And, the word spread. He became like a folk hero of this battle, like the invincible George Washington. It wasn't just, the colonists, the Indians who fought against him knew about it, respected him. But he was a guy that they couldn't be shot. I think there was one Indian that told a story that he shot at him like a dozen times. And eventually he just figured he was being protected by the spirits, and he just stopped shooting, because he said, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to try to kill this guy, because, the war gods are protecting him. And I think Washington thought it was divine providence that somehow spared him. But anyway, so he's got this big reputation. So then when the Revolutionary War is breaking out, he goes to Washington and he volunteers. Right? He wasn't drafted. He volunteers. Hey, I want to fight. And they made him the General Washington, because he had a big reputation. But anyway, so he was the general of the colonial army, except we didn't really have an army. There was just militia. All the various, colonies had their own militia. So it's kind of like a ragtag group of guys that he has to hobble together to fight the British. The British, right? The British back then was like the American army today, right? They were the most powerful army in the world, the best trained, the best armed, right? King George, he's got this huge army, right? So we're going to lose for sure. I mean, we're just a massive underdogs. I mean, all the founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence expected to get hung, right? Who thought, I mean, how are we going to win this war? Right? And of course, Washington would have been killed if they would have lost the war. There's no way they wouldn't have chopped his head off or hung him, for treason, right? Because you're treason to the crown. You're fighting against your king. So, we have this long shot battle, and somehow we outlasted the British. I mean, it was like a 6 or 7 year war, and we won it. I mean, it was war of attrition. I mean, we somehow survived. We won a couple of key battles, but it was mostly just, surviving, and getting the British eventually got tired of fighting us, and they gave up. But we won. We won that war. Miracle of miracles. I don't know if any other general could have done what Washington was able to do with these troops. But then when he wins the war, right, and he's in command of the army, he doesn't like, okay, this is my country now. I'm in charge. He just said, okay, we won the war. I'm going home. I'm going back to my farm. And, obviously it wasn't a modest farm. I mean, he was very wealthy. Martha, his wife, came from money. In fact, he was the richest president adjusted for inflation. I think his net worth was not quite $1 billion in today's terms, but 700-800 million, something like that. But he was the richest person to be president until John F. Kennedy became president. And today he's number 3. Obviously, Donald Trump is the richest person to be president. And he's even richer now because he's president, but I don't want to go there right now. But so he's, the 3rd wealthiest person who's been president. But so he didn't go, he went back to his civilian life. Now, after that, there was a serious movement to make George Washington king of America. And if Washington wanted to be king of America, he'd have been the king. He had so much support. He was so popular that if he wanted to be king, he'd have been king. He turned it down. He did not want to be king. He didn't believe in monarchy. He wanted America to be a republic, to be self-governed. So he turned down the throne. Who would do something like that? And so he became the first president of the United States, almost by default, right? And of course, even after he was reelected, he could have been elected a 3rd time. He could have stayed president until he died. But he set the precedent after 2 terms. He said, that's enough. I'm gone. I'm leaving. I'm stepping down. And every president who followed Washington honored that tradition until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And because he didn't, that's what prompted the constitutional amendment that limited the presidential term to 2 terms. But Washington didn't need that. He did it himself because that's the kind of guy that he was. He believed in the cause that he fought for. He believed in America and the concept of self-government. Right? And also, just to give you an idea of the kind of guy, the heroic person that he was. So when he's president of the United States, right, the first rebellion, right? The government imposes a tax on whiskey. And there are a lot of people who didn't want to pay the tax, right? Americans, we don't like paying taxes, right? The whole country was formed by a bunch of tax protesters, right? They didn't want to pay taxes to to King George. Now, in hindsight, the taxes, I would love to live in America under King George compared to what we got now. If you look at the taxes that the King was imposing, they're nothing. I'd pay those in a heartbeat. Taxes on tea or, stamp taxes. Do you think King George would have tried to impose an income tax? You think he would have set up an IRS in the colonies and tried to take 20, 30, 40% of people's income? No, there's no way he would have done anything like that. No king would have done something that bad. Of course, everybody would revolt if a king tried to impose that kind of a tax. No, these were small little taxes that England tried to impose. And Americans still didn't want to pay them. And it wasn't just, we want representation, no taxation without representation. They didn't want to pay the taxes either. Right? Because, they didn't think the king had any right to that money. And so when we have a new country, and now we have this whiskey tax, right? No, there's no income tax. There's no Social Security tax. There's none of that. Just a tax on whiskey, right? And so people don't want to pay it. So there's a big, rebellion out in Pennsylvania to pay this, as though the whiskey rebellion. So George Washington is the president. Well, I gotta put this rebellion down. So what does he do? He puts on his uniform, gets on his horse, and he leads, what we got of an army, which is really, again, calling up the militia. But he gets some troops together, gets on his horse, and leads the charge himself in the battle to put down this rebellion. How many presidents, right? It's very easy for a president to have a war. How many presidents are going to lead the charge in that war? No, they're all a bunch of chicken hawks, right? It's easy to send somebody's kids into battle. It's one thing to go into battle yourself. And that's what he did. And he didn't just he wasn't in the back. He didn't have a bunch of troops and he went, and he was hiding in the back. He was way out in the front. He was going to be the first one to get shot. So look, he was a heroic American hero. There'll never be another George Washington. Obviously, there'll never be another father of our country because the country is only fathered once. And so above all other Americans who have lived, if you're going to have a holiday, he's the man that we have to honor. And I don't care if somebody wants to say, oh, what he owned slaves. Who cares? Everybody owned slaves back then. I mean, it wasn't, it was a different time. But if you look at what this man did for this country, the sacrifices he made, the heroism in battle, both before we became a country, to make us a country, and then after, that's why we need to have Washington's birthday. We don't need to celebrate anybody else's birthday. None of these other presidents can hold a candle. Yeah, I still like some of the presidents, Adams and Jefferson. Yeah, a lot of those guys were great presidents. And there are even some presidents that came later that I like. Grover Cleveland is one of my favorite presidents. And until Donald Trump, Grover Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But still, I wouldn't put any other president on the same level as George Washington. So think about that next year when President's Day comes along. Celebrate Washington's birthday. We got a quick commercial break. We're coming back. I got more to talk about, so don't go away.